for joining us for this webinar about frogging and citizen science and the Frog Census app. So today I have joining me David Angelis, who is an ecologist and a self-professed frog nerd, and he is going to share with us his knowledge about the frogs that are commonly found across the Greater Melbourne area. But just before we get started, I will acknowledge the traditional owners, and I'll make my screen move forward. There we go. So today I'm coming from you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri as the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Thank you. And I think, David, you may be coming to us from Wurundjeri country as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Excellent. So, as I said, very shortly we're going to hear from David, but I was just going to talk to you a little bit about citizen science. I'm not sure whether you're aware of what citizen science is, but essentially it's about everyone working together to collect information about generally about biodiversity in the areas where they are located. And coming up this weekend will be the City Nature Challenge. And this was started back in 2016 as a bit of a friendly competition between Los Angeles and San Francisco. And they were wanting to document the urban biodiversity. So it became a little bit of a friendly rivalry between those two cities. And this has now caught on internationally, and many cities around the world now participate in the City Nature Challenge. So this weekend, many local councils will be getting involved with the City Nature Challenge and encouraging people that live in their council areas to get out and document the biodiversity that's found in their local areas. Now, for the whole of the Greater Melbourne region, the best way to gather records on frogs is using the Frog Census app, and that's what you can see in the picture there. So the Frog Census is free to download for both Android and Apple phones, any smartphones, it will work. And it has been designed specifically to make it really easy to gather information on frogs. And the way that we do that is by recording the sounds that the frogs make, because that is really the definitive way to identify frogs, because they tend to vary in size and colour, and they are particularly elusive and very hard to find. So it's much better if we just get out and record the sounds of frogs calling. So that's the way that the Frog Census app works. Once you submit your record, and I'll talk more about how to do that later on, but once you submit that record, that recording of the frog sounds, it goes to our expert ecologists who will listen to that recording and identify the species that are calling. So that way we know that we're collecting research grade data, and we can share that widely with researchers, students and land managers to make sure that everyone has a good understanding of what frogs are out there. This information is really important to help us at Melbourne Water manage waterways and to protect habitat for frogs. But we will talk a little bit more about that later on. So now let's hear from David about the frogs that are commonly found in our urban environment. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and hand that over to David. Thank you, David, and welcome.
Great, thanks, Jane. I'm going to attempt to share mine. So, all going well. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that.
Yep, looks great.
Very good. All right. So I'm going to give a reasonably brief overview of some of the, or most of the frogs of Greater Melbourne, but not necessarily touch on all of the species that might be found throughout Greater Melbourne. But I will talk about or introduce some of the more common ones that we might expect to record commonly, necessarily regardless of where we are in the Greater Melbourne area for some species. But I'll also touch on a couple that have become a lot rarer than they were historically and are now considered threatened species, as well as a couple that never used to occur in the Melbourne area, but have arrived more recently and established themselves. And as well as mentioning aspects of their ecology and identification, I'll also be playing sound recordings of each of the species that I'll talk about. So if you haven't necessarily being able to match a face to the call, so to speak, or you've heard some of these calls before, but not necessarily recognise what frogs they come from, you might be able to recognise that now when I show you. So the common froglet, along with one or probably two other species, can fairly enough be considered the most abundant frog throughout most of the Greater Melbourne area. And they have an advantage over many other species that occur locally in that they can take advantage of standing water that only hangs around fairly temporarily. So almost puddles or seasonally inundated areas, because their tadpoles can turn into frogs from the time that they hatch in as little as 6 weeks, but it may be up to 3 months or more, depending on environmental conditions. But that means that they can use a really wide range of water bodies to breed in terms of their water permanency. And another advantage that this species has, as opposed to some others in the Melbourne area, is that it seems to be largely tolerant of the amphibian chytrid fungus, which, as many of us probably know, is an introduced disease affecting many frogs, but not all frogs. And this species is one of a handful that doesn't seem to suffer any ill effects, but can still carry the fungus. And it's been implicated in being a vector and spreading it around to other species that are susceptible to the disease. And in terms of being able to identify it and distinguish it from other frogs in the Greater Melbourne area, it's about the smaller species that we have. So not pushing much more than a couple of centimetres long, and incredibly variable in its appearance, not only in the colour or shade of brown to almost an olive green on some, but in terms of pattern. So you get ones that are stripy, ones that are completely plain or uniformly coloured, ones that have spots, and even skin texture. So there are individuals that can come from the same clutch that are covered in warts, ones that are smooth-skinned, and ones with ridges along their back. If you ask them nicely to turn over and have a look at their bellies, that pattern tends to be a bit more standardised or reliable. So, but even then there's variation in the black and white marbling, but they tend to always have that. And it tends to be a bit bolder actually in the females. But it's obviously not easy with, certainly not without permits and concerns around hygiene, to be able to find and look at frogs in that way, obviously. So that's why the frog census is so useful, because in terms of this species, its call is fairly different to just about every other species of frog that we're likely to record in the Melbourne area, maybe with one or two exceptions. So while the Victorian smooth froglets are around about the same size, maybe a bit bigger, often than common froglet, so not much more than 3 centimetres long still. It has a very different call, obviously. And the late Murray Littlejohn, who only passed away last year, was fairly enough considered one of the fathers of modern frog biology, not just in Victoria or Australia, but globally, was able to figure out the meaning of the two parts to this species call. So I might just play it again quickly. So there are two obviously different notes. The first note, which is more drawn out and a bit raspier, so ramping up, is only directed to other males. So it's the territorial call of this species, whereas the shorter piping notes at the end of the call are only directed to females. And at this point, I should probably mention that it's only the male frogs that make both of those types of call, which we refer to as advertisement calls. But they're not just advertising to females, they're also talking to other males to let them know to try and keep out of their way. And the only other thing I'll mention in relation to this species is that it breeds in a very different way to most of the other frogs that we have around Melbourne, in that it lays its eggs on land. But in low-lying areas that flood with late autumn and more so winter rain. And so the idea is that they're breeding at this time of year, in autumn, when we get, hopefully, a lot more rain. The areas where it's laid its eggs will be covered in water, and that's when the eggs will hatch. However, the tadpoles take up to about 6 months, maybe slightly shorter, to turn into a frog from a tadpole. So all that means is that hopefully the water remains for that long until into spring in those areas where it's bred. And the southern toadlet does something very similar in terms of where it breeds and lays its eggs, and at this time of year as well. So this species and the Victorian smooth froglet often overlap in terms of the areas where they do breed. But if anything, the southern toadlet has a preference to even slightly more dry habitats. And so it's meant that this species has found itself in a bit of trouble, in no small part, because of the increasing frequency and duration of droughts, and decrease, for example, in spring rainfall, because even though it has a slight preference towards breeding in slightly drier sites, its tadpoles still take around 6 months, potentially a little bit longer sometimes, to turn into a frog from the time that the eggs hatch. And it's meant that a lot of the areas where the southern toadlet used to breed successfully are no longer apparently able to support it. And I wanted to mention brown or Bibron's toadlet, which is a closely related species, although many of the spots where it historically was known to occur around Melbourne no longer seem to support it. It may still occur slightly further out of Melbourne, and they are very cryptic, so being able to detect them can potentially be an issue as well. But otherwise, it has more or less identical habits to the southern toadlet in terms of when and where it breeds, and for similar reasons, it's found itself in trouble. So both this species and the southern toadlet are considered endangered in Victoria, except most of the points on the map that you can see to the east of Melbourne seem to be incorrect. So this is a bit of a back of the envelope map that Murray Littlejohn, who I mentioned, made to illustrate the very narrow overlap zone between the brown or Bibron's toadlet and the southern toadlet in Melbourne. And it almost follows the Hume Highway, so directly north of the city. And historically, east of that line, you wouldn't get brown or Bibron's toadlet, although that's where a lot of the historic records have been made for that species in the various online atlases. Suffice to say, one of the main people responsible for those records to the east of that hybrid zone has now acknowledged that they were incorrect, and they were actually belong to the southern toadlet, and that's looking at being corrected at some stage, hopefully soon, at least in the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas. This hybrid zone doesn't really, it's not really reflected currently, mainly because in that area of overlap, both species seem to have significantly declined to the point where you're not likely to find them in the overwhelming majority of those spots where Murray had recorded them in the 60s anymore, unfortunately. Along with the common froglet, and again, maybe another one or two species, the spotted marsh frog, luckily for it, remains one of the most abundant species throughout most of Melbourne. and probably, at least partly because it shares something in common with the common froglet, which is that it can take advantage of more temporary sources of water to breed in. Although the tadpoles tend to take a little bit longer to develop, still a shorter time than it takes for the tadpoles of a lot of the other local frogs to develop. So they'll often breed in more temporary ponds, as well as more permanent bodies of water. And like the common froglet, the spotted marsh frog seems to be very tolerant to chytrid fungus. And it was discovered a few decades ago now through the Amphibian Research Centre, working with a student, that this species produces peptides in its skin, which are antifungal. So I seem to be able to help it in that way. The closely related striped marsh frog grows to a much larger size than the spotted marsh frog, and seems to have a preference for more permanent bodies of water, or if they only hold water temporarily, generally a trend towards holding water for a longer period of time. And partly because its tadpoles grow a lot larger and can remain as tadpoles for a lot longer. So the development of most tadpoles can be very staggered. So while you get some turning into frogs in the same season that the eggs have been laid, some tadpoles, and particularly of this species, can overwinter. So the striped marsh frog breeds mainly in spring and into summer, potentially. And some of the tadpoles, while most of them complete their development in the same season that the eggs are laid at that time of year, some of them can remain tadpoles through the winter and complete their development in the following spring or summer. And the pobblebonk or banjo frog does a very similar thing in terms of its larval lifespan, or how long the tadpoles might remain in the water for. Although again, most of them will complete their development in the same season when the eggs were laid. Although, like the striped marsh frog, it seems to have a preference towards more permanently hydrated water bodies, where the water sticks around for a bit longer, also breeding in spring and into summer. But the eastern banjo frog or pobblebonk has an advantage over the spotted and striped marsh frogs in that it can burrow. So a lot of people have the experience of digging them up in the garden or in the sandpit or the compost heap, and they can withstand drying out and travel fairly long distances from water by burrowing underground, which means that you often can find them a long way away from water, but they're still tied back to those water bodies to breed in. And I might mention, so its other common name, pobblebonk, when you hear the call, 3 notes in succession, pobblebonk, it was discovered that that call is made by 3 different individual banjo frogs, not a single individual. So it's a trio that makes that pobblebonk call. Along with the southern ambibrans or brown toadlet, the growling grass frogs also found itself in a lot of trouble to the extent that it's considered vulnerable at the state level, but also nationally. So throughout its entire distribution, which covers parts of Tasmania, as well as southern Victoria, and northern Victoria into Canberra and New South Wales, but it's declined over most of that distribution, and mainly due to the amphibian chytrid fungus, which I mentioned. But otherwise, they seem to be fairly tolerant of even living in fairly otherwise degraded habitats sometimes, but nowhere near as commonly as what the map shows with those historic records in the Atlas of Living Australia. So as far as is known, to the east of Melbourne, there's the remaining stronghold tends to be towards Western Port and the southeast outer suburbs, but only otherwise found still relatively commonly in some of the Basalt Creek catchments to the north and west of Melbourne on the volcanic plain and closer to the coast, for example, around Werribee. And only relatively recently rediscovered holding on in the Yarra catchment near Coldstream. So the population there apparently remains fairly isolated, being the only remaining area in the wider Yarra catchment where we know the growling grass frog's still holding on. So along with maybe the spotted marsh frog and common froglet, the brown tree frog's probably the other species that, at least in the Melbourne area and more widely, remains one of the most abundant. And although it does suffer from chytrid fungus, it seems to have been able to persist reasonably well, and possibly because it matures and breeds fairly rapidly at most times of year, and including at the slightly warmer times of year when chytrid fungus doesn't seem to do so well. And having sticky pads, or being a tree frog, having sticky pads on its fingers and toes gives it obviously a climbing ability that most of the other frogs that I've talked about don't have. Although, like a couple of the other tree frogs in Melbourne, doesn't tend to climb trees so much, but it might do on the lower trunk, but otherwise climbing maybe shrubs, but otherwise mostly sedges, grasses, and rushes, growing usually fairly close to the water. But they also climb windows at night, chasing after bugs, and they'll get into plant pots and in watering cans and up downpipes and that sort of thing. And occasionally breed in swimming pools, especially when they turn nice and slimy and green with algae in winter if they're left uncovered. The very closely related Veros or whistling tree frog is so closely related to the brown tree frog that they're strongly suspected of hybridising in the areas where they overlap, which is over much of Melbourne. But if anything, the whistling tree frog seems to have a preference to slightly wetter or damper areas. So a little bit more common to the east of the city than the west. And can be distinguished from southern brown tree frog when they're not hybridising by having usually large, obvious black spots or blotches in the groin. So the area on the rear side of the body that's usually largely covered up by the folded up back legs. But you can just see a bit of the pattern sticking out above the back leg in this photo. And when they do hybridise, their appearance and call sounds something in between. Except in the whistling tree frog, when they're cooperating, so the parent species, the call is a lot smoother and a bit more rapid and slightly higher pitched than the call of the southern brown tree frog, which is at a bit lower frequency and more raspy than the whistling tree frog. Heron's tree frog, or the other was very appropriately named maniacal cackling frog, is not actually indigenous to the Greater Melbourne area. So this species turned up for the first time in 1985 at Yanyan Reservoir, discovered by none other than Murray Littlejohn and a colleague of his, Peter Harrison. And since then, it's pretty much spread everywhere, and along with the only other introduced frog species in Melbourne, which I'll mention next, is the only one that seems to be increasing in its local distribution and abundance in Melbourne, as well as other parts of Victoria where it never used to occur, mainly in the southwest. So naturally, Perrin's tree frog occurred mainly north of the Great Dividing Range, up to the Murray River, but also in East Gippsland. And unlike our local tree frogs, Perrin's tree frogs has really large, sticky discs on its fingers and toes, which give it even better climbing ability. So Perrin's tree frog gets right up occasionally into the canopy of trees, and they'll get into tree hollows and occasionally get found in nest boxes. And it can be remembered by its other name, as in the maniacal cackling frog, because it's the only frog in the Melbourne area that has a cross-shaped pupil, whereas the pupils of all the other frogs in Melbourne are either, well, vertical or horizontal. Okay, and this one's not playing its call for some reason, but I might try and play its call from the app if it's not going to work otherwise. Okay. So hopefully you can hear that. So the eastern dwarf tree frog is the only other species, as I mentioned, in Melbourne that's introduced, but from a bit further afield in this case. So along the east coast of New South Wales and Queensland, but about as far south as, well, only between Bega and Wollongong. But far enough south at least that it's been able to survive our cold winters in Melbourne and breed here. And as I mentioned, is the case with Perrin's tree frog, eastern dwarf tree frog seems to be continuing to expand in its local range up and down the Yarra catchment and now further afield. And this species is suggested to be tolerant to chytrid fungus, but again might be implicated in or have the ability to spread it to our local frogs. And at this stage, it's not necessarily known whether or how much of a negative impact it might be having for our local frogs because of the disease risk that it might pose, or through competition or for any other reason. But there might be a project there for some poor student before too much longer to try and find out. All right. Thanks very much. I might leave it there. Stop sharing.
East or west, really interesting. Now I'm going to share and talk a little bit about the why and the how.
Oh, hang on, Jane. Sorry, something's changed in my sound settings. I can't. Oh, there we are. I should be able to hear you now. Yep.
Excellent. Lovely. Okay, so why do we need data about frogs? So there's a number of reasons why, but frogs are one of the most threatened vertebrate classes on Earth. So about 40% of species across the world are threatened. And so if we don't understand what frogs are out there, it's very difficult for us to protect those frog species and their habitat. So that's a key reason for learning more about where frogs are found. The other key reason why it's important to know more about frogs is because they're a really important indicator of ecosystem health. There's a number of reasons why, but one reason is because they're midway in the food chain. So they are agile hunters and predators. As David mentioned, they're very good at catching insects. So they're doing a great job for us there and managing insect populations. But they're also a significant source of food for higher predators as well. So that function being midway in the food chain means that if frog species are absent, then that ecosystem is not really going to function very well, missing that key species. We also think that frogs are an important indicator as well of environmental health because of their sensitivity. Their very permeable skin means that some species can be quite vulnerable to pollution. So the Melbourne Water Healthy Waterways Strategy uses data on frogs as a key indicator. So this tells us how we're performing in terms of improving and managing waterways across the Melbourne area. So there's about 5 different indicators that we use, but frogs are one of those key indicator species. So we need to have data on frogs to know whether we're doing a good job or not of managing the waterways in the Melbourne area. Now, the Frog Census app was developed by Melbourne Water in about 2016, and it makes it really easy to gather data on frogs because we can capture their sounds when they're calling, and that data then is submitted to us via the app. So it's a very quick and easy way to get involved in citizen science. Anyone can do it, and you don't really need to be a frog expert. You just need to be able to hear those calls and get out to record them. So I'm just going to step you through a few key points about using the app to help make it easier for you to use it. And I've got a few slides to help with some of those descriptions. So one of the things that the app does is it relies on the GPS data from your phone to locate where you're recording that call from. So that's really important to give us that kind of geographic distribution of frog species, very like the maps that David shared with you earlier. So sometimes people don't like to have the location services turned on in their phone, and that's completely fair enough. But you do have the choice of just choosing to turn that on while you're using the app. And you can do that by going into the settings of your phone and select use location while using the app. Within my phone, I noticed too in the settings that there was an option to select precise location. So that's another good option to choose when you're setting up your phone to use the Frog Census app. So one of the things that really helps to make sure that the app works well when you're using it is to keep your software up to date. So you'll notice that regularly you get notifications about phone software. So if you keep up to date with all of those new versions, that will help to make sure that the app works really well for you, no matter what phone you're using. So the app is really very easy to use. And if you look at the right-hand screen image. So these are images from the app. So this is what it will look like when you're using it. And that right-hand image has the numbers 1 to 4 across the top. So they're basically the steps that you need to follow when you're submitting your frog record. So it's very easy to work through that. And the first thing that you do is press the big red button in your screen to start the recording process. So that allows you to record for up to 5 minutes, but there's no need necessarily to record for that length of time unless you're doing a very structured monitoring program where you want to go and do the same thing each time. If you're just doing a random report because you've heard a frog calling while you're out, as long as you're sure that you've recorded all the frogs, all the different species that you can hear calling, that's sufficiently long enough to record. So potentially you could record for about a minute. Once you've done that, you progress to the next screen, which enables you to take a photo. So it's not always necessary to take a photo. Sometimes I do it because it helps to remind me of where I've taken that record in case I want to go back to that location again. It can also be useful to give our ecologists a bit more of an understanding about where you are collecting that frog record from. However, I understand that sometimes you're out in the pitch dark and photos are not really going to work very well. So that's an option. You have the option to choose to take up to 3 photos. When you take the photos within the app, they're not stored in your photo gallery on your phone. So that's something to remember as well. The next step, and probably one of the most important steps, is to record your location. Now, the app gives you 2 options. It says use my current location or select from the map. So what I suggest you do is use my current location, and that will generate a a latitude and a longitude for your current location, which you can see on that screen on the left-hand side. It's also really worthwhile just checking that that is an accurate representation of where you are located. So you can see the screen on the right-hand side is what you will see if you select from map. So it's placed a red pin for the location, which represents that latitude and longitude. Now, when you go into that select from map, if you notice that that location is not quite right, it's very easy to just drag that pin and adjust the location just to make it a bit more accurate. That's a really important step because sometimes we find when people have submitted a record and their location's not very accurate, we can end up with records that are in the middle of a road, for example, and we know that it's not likely that the frog is located there. So that's really helpful if you can make sure to just check on that location that it's correct before you submit your record. The next thing to do is to add some details into your record. You can choose the species that you hear calling. It doesn't matter if you don't know what the calls are. You can have a bit of a guess and gradually over time get better at recognising some of the more common calls. But if you don't know what frog it is, you can just scroll down to the bottom of the selection options and choose unknown frog species, which is the bottom left hand there. So you just select that one, and then the recording that you submit will be identified down the track. So in addition to the species, you can have an estimate the number of frogs that you think are calling. So there's categories to make it a little bit easier. Again, it doesn't matter if it's not super accurate, but over time you find you will get better at judging roughly the number of frogs that you think you can hear calling. So give your location a name, ideally something quite descriptive, because that helps again with us checking on the location data. So if you're calling from, the frogs are calling, if you're listening to the frogs calling from a local wetland or park, you can use the name of that area to help with that location information. And lastly, in the comments section, you can also include a bit of detail about the current weather conditions. Frogs tend to call most often after recent rain, so it's useful to have a little bit of that information in there as well. Once you've completed all those boxes, it's just a case of using the submit button, which is in the bottom right-hand corner there, and that record will then be submitted to us. Now, on some occasions, if you're out in the field, you may not have any phone service, or you may not want to use your mobile phone service. That's okay, because the record will actually save to your phone, and once you return home and you have a Wi-Fi, you can then submit the report. So it's really good to go back into the reports section of the app every now and again, just to make sure that you don't have any reports sitting there that have not been submitted. So you can see in my phone in this list here, there'll be a tick and a green box to indicate the records that have actually been submitted. And then there are some you can see with this cloud symbol that are ready to submit. So they're the ones that I need to click on once I'm back home and submit those records. You can then go into the map part of the app, and you can select to see just your reports, and that way you can double check that you have actually submitted the report that you think you've submitted. And you can, within that map function on the app, you can select the data in various ways. So you can select the time period, you can look at specific species records as well. And you can then, once you've filtered that data, you can, if you want to, send yourself a CSV file. So the data's all accessible to everyone who uses the app. Now, the thing that you will notice, though, when you look at your records on the map is they'll be coloured a kind of an orangey colour with a question mark until the call has been verified. So our ecologists listen to all the reports that are submitted, and within about 2 to 4 weeks, they will actually verify all of those calls and identify which frog species are calling. And as I said, this is a really important step in the process, because then we know that we're collecting research grade data. So we're collecting quality data because we know that all of the records have been professionally identified. So you will then see, once your record has been identified, the little spot will turn to a green tick. And as I say, that takes roughly 2 to 4 weeks. Now, where are we at? So that's pretty much the whole process. And it's a really good idea, just before you decide that you want to head out to collect a recording, is to look at the weather conditions, because you don't want to be wasting your time. So the frogs are quite sensitive to weather and to the time of the year. So the key months that we ask people to go out and collect frog records are April, August, October and November. So if we collect recordings over those months, we're most likely to capture all of the frogs that are calling or potentially calling in the Melbourne region. So the weather, you want to make sure that it's not too cold. So ideally above 12 degrees and with very light winds. Frogs are not likely to be calling on very windy nights, because they're wasting their energy and their calls may not be heard by the right frog if it's very windy. So ideally, again, as I say, go out just after it's rained is the perfect time when you're most likely to hear frogs calling, and wait till about 30 minutes after sunset. So once you get to your location where you're going to make your record, just wait there for a few minutes to enable the frogs to get used to your presence. So standing quietly in that location, and while you're doing that, listening out to see how many different calls you think you can hear. So roughly make a count, are you hearing 2 or 3 different calls? And then you will know how long to make your recording once you start recording, so that you can capture all of those sounds. If you are in a location where there's wind or traffic noises or other sounds, it's a good idea if you can position yourself with your back to the sound and turn your phone towards the direction where the frogs are calling, so that we can get the best quality record. And that's essentially it. That's as easy as it is to collect a frog record. So I am expecting to see lots of frog records coming in after you've listened to this really interesting presentation by David and learned so much more about the frogs that are found in the Melbourne region. So I want to thank you again, David, for your presentation. Really, really useful and fascinating. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
No worries, yeah. See ya.
Bye. Just trying to, okay. There, I've